When the ground beneath you feels most uncertain, God's voice becomes clearest. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this season isn't confusing your purpose, it's sharpening it. I know that sounds backward, maybe even cruel. You're worried about bills, about stability, about whether you can make it through another month of financial pressure, and here I am, saying God speaks loudest in the shake. But stay with me, because what I'm about to share might change how you see this entire season. If you've been feeling like your finances are unstable, like no matter how hard you work, the security never comes, like you're one emergency away from collapse, the pressure is real, the anxiety is real, the exhaustion of waking up every morning, wondering if this is sustainable, is deeply real. You make enough to survive, but not enough to breathe. And if anyone has told you that your financial uncertainty means you lack faith, they don't understand how God works. Because sometimes, financial pressure isn't a sign that you're off track. Sometimes it's a sign that God is clarifying something so important that He had to remove the noise first. This isn't about God punishing you. This is about God redirecting you. And there's a massive difference. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through why purpose often becomes crystal clear exactly when money feels most uncertain. And once you see this, you won't interpret this season the same way again. Here's what most people miss. We think clarity comes from stability. We believe that once we're financially comfortable, once we have margin, once we're not constantly worried, then we'll figure out our calling. Then we'll hear God. Then we'll understand our purpose. But that's not how it works. And there's a reason this feels so uncomfortable. I'll explain that in a moment. Because comfort creates options, and options create noise. When you have multiple paths available, when you're secure enough to choose anything, your mind fills with possibilities. Should I stay? Should I pivot? Should I invest here? Should I take that risk? The abundance of choice doesn't bring clarity. It brings confusion. But when financial uncertainty enters the picture, when your options narrow, when you can't afford to keep living on autopilot, something shifts. The noise starts to quiet. The unnecessary falls away, and suddenly, what truly matters becomes visible. God often speaks loudest when security is removed, not because He's cruel, but because He knows we don't listen well when we're comfortable. There's a moment in the book of Deuteronomy where Moses is speaking to a generation that survived the wilderness. They're standing on the edge of the promised land, and Moses reminds them why the journey was so hard. He says God led them through the wilderness, allowed them to hunger, fed them with manna, and all of it was to humble them and test them, to know what was in their hearts, not to destroy them, to reveal them. The scarcity wasn't punishment, it was purification. It was God stripping away dependence on everything except Him so they could see clearly who they were and what they were called to. That's what financial pressure does. It removes the luxury of distraction. It forces you to ask the questions you've been avoiding. Am I doing this because it pays well, or because it aligns with who God made me to be? Am I staying here out of calling or out of fear? Have I been so focused on building security that I forgot to ask God what I'm building toward? You're responsible, faithful, exhausted, and still unsure. Financial uncertainty isn't confusion, it's clarity forming. And that terrifies us because clarity demands response. As long as things are vague, as long as we're too busy surviving to question the direction, we can avoid making hard decisions. But when money tightens and purpose sharpens, we can't ignore it anymore. This is the part where most people get scared, because clarity sounds beautiful until it asks you to change something. Let me take you deeper. There's a story in 1 Kings about the prophet Elijah. God sends him to a brook called Cherith during a national crisis. Famine is coming, drought is spreading, and God tells Elijah, "Go to this brook, drink from it, and I'll send ravens to feed you." So Elijah obeys. He goes. The water flows. The ravens come. It's miraculous. It's provision. It's proof that God is taking care of him. And then, without warning, the brook dries up. Now here's what makes this story so powerful. God doesn't explain why. He doesn't say, Elijah, the brook is drying because you did something wrong. He doesn't say, this is a test of your faith. He just lets it dry. And then he says, get up and go to Zarephath. A new place, a new assignment. A widow who's down to her last meal. The point? The provision that sustained Elijah yesterday doesn't guarantee alignment today. God let the brook dry not to punish Elijah, but to redirect him. Because if the water kept flowing, Elijah would have stayed, and staying would have meant missing the next part of the calling. How many of us are holding on to a financial source that used to work, used to provide, used to make sense, but deep down we know it's drying up? And we're terrified because we think the drying means God has abandoned us. But what if it doesn't mean abandonment? What if it means direction? What if God is saying, that season served its purpose, but if you stay here, you'll miss where I'm taking you next? Here's where we resist. Because redirecting means letting go. It means trusting God's timing over your comfort. It means believing that He sees something you can't see yet, and that requires a level of dependence most of us aren't ready for. We say we trust God, but we structure our lives to need Him as little as possible. We build safety nets, backup plans, multiple income streams, all so we never have to fully rely on Him. And there's wisdom in preparation, but when preparation becomes our primary source of security instead of God, we've crossed a line. We've made provision our God, and God will let that provision shake, not because He wants to harm us, but because He wants to reclaim His place. The prophet Habakkuk understood this better than most. He wrote during a time of national collapse. The economy was failing, crops weren't growing, livestock was dying, everything that represented stability was crumbling. And in the middle of that chaos, Habakkuk makes one of the most powerful declarations in Scripture. He says, though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. Do you hear what he's saying? He's not denying the loss. He's not pretending everything is fine. He's saying, even when every visible source of provision is gone, I will still rejoice. Why? Because his identity wasn't tied to the harvest. His purpose wasn't dependent on the economy. His calling existed independent of his circumstances. And that's what financial uncertainty reveals. It shows you what you've been building your identity on. If losing money shakes your sense of purpose, your purpose was built on the wrong foundation. Now let's bring this into your life. Most people never notice this pattern until it's too late. You're working hard. You're doing everything right. And still, the pressure won't let up. You're tired of wondering if you'll make it. You're tired of the constant anxiety. You're tired of feeling behind. You're not failing. You're tired of pretending this is enough. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you're asking, if God has a plan for me, why does it feel like I'm barely surviving? God is not withholding clarity to torture you. He's withholding comfort to position you. Because the version of you that walks into your calling can't be the version of you that needs financial stability to obey. The person God is shaping you into has to be someone who moves when He says move, even when the bank account says wait. Someone who trusts His voice over the balance sheet. Someone whose sense of direction comes from alignment with Him, not approval from the world. And that kind of faith? It's not formed in abundance. It's formed in uncertainty. When you have to choose between what feels safe and what feels right. When you have to decide if you're going to keep doing what pays well or start doing what you were made for. When you realize that playing it safe might cost you your calling. The Apostle Paul wrote from prison, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And then he says, I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. We love quoting that last part, but we ignore the context. Paul's strength didn't come from having options. It came from learning to thrive, whether he had much or little. His purpose wasn't conditional. It wasn't dependent on financial security. It was anchored in God. That's the shift. That's the clarity financial uncertainty brings. It forces you to stop tying your calling to your circumstances. It teaches you that God's plan for your life doesn't wait for your budget to be comfortable. It moves when He says, move. And if you've been waiting for financial stability before you step into your purpose, you might be waiting forever. Because God often clarifies calling after security is shaken, not before. So what do you do with this? How do you move forward when the ground feels unstable? First, stop interpreting financial pressure as punishment. It's not God's anger, it's God's refinement. He's clearing away what doesn't belong so you can see what does. Second, ask yourself the hard question. What am I holding on to because it feels safe, not because it's where I'm supposed to be? And third, start listening for direction instead of waiting for provision. Because sometimes God provides after you move, not before. If this word is landing on something deep inside you, if you've been carrying financial anxiety and wondering if God sees you, He does. This pressure you're feeling isn't random, it's intentional. Not to break you, but to redirect you. And the clearer your purpose becomes, the less your peace will depend on your bank account. If this feels like a season of redirection for you, type redirected in the comments. I read every one. Let's build a community of people who are learning to trust God's voice over financial comfort. And if you found this helpful, share it with someone who's been feeling the weight of financial uncertainty. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that God is still moving, even when money feels unstable. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next reflection. And remember, you're not behind, you're not forgotten. And God's silence about your finances is not rejection, it's preparation. Stay anchored, stay listening. God doesn't clarify purpose by making life easier. He clarifies it by removing what no longer fits who you're becoming.